and this PowerPoint presentation will be available. So with that, we're going to go and get started with our keynote speakers.
Actually, the President and CEO of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, and I'm joined here. Nick, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Nick Breul. I'm the Director of Officer Safety and Wellness. I'm a retired Metropolitan Police Officer from here in D.C. and manage our many grant and research-funded projects that we have here at the Memorial Fund.
And so to get started, because we are going to give you a lot of information here, just wanted to let everybody know that they can download this PowerPoint slide presentation. We have a website that we've created. It's www.lawmemorial.org/IACP 2016. So you can certainly download that and share that with as many folks as you can. We certainly appreciate that. Let's go just a little background on our organization. I'm the founding CEO, and we've been doing this now for 32 years, founded in 1984. Our vision is to inspire every citizen to value law enforcement, and there is no better way to show how much we value law enforcement than to make sure that officer safety and wellness is a top priority at the federal, state, and local level. Our mission is to tell the story of American law enforcement and to make it safer for those who serve. So clearly, officer safety and wellness is a primary mission of our organization. Here you see on the next slide a beautiful photograph of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial located in a place called Judiciary Square, the 400 block of E Street, Northwest Washington, D.C., about 6 blocks from the U.S. Capitol, to give it some perspective, about 3 blocks off the National Mall. And on the walls of that memorial are the names of 20,789 officers, federal, state, local, territorial, and tribal, who have all died in the line of duty dating back to the first death in 1791. And each year we do add new names to the memorial. We do that at our annual Candlelight Vigil, which you see here on the next slide. This year, for the first time ever, we held it on the National Mall. We've grown to about 30,000 people who attend, and because we're now under construction with the National Law Enforcement Museum at our memorial site, it made it difficult to hold it at the memorial. So we are at the mall now, and it's a tremendous venue for us. Here you see a rendering of the National Law Enforcement Museum, and now the footprint that you see, it's right across from the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial. Congress gave us that land to build the National Law Enforcement Museum back in the year 2000. We've made a determined effort over the last 16 years to get that museum built, and I'm very pleased and proud to say that we are now under construction. Construction on the National Law Enforcement Museum started in April. We are now down about 60 feet below the surface. This is mainly an underground museum, and when it opens in 2018, we're going to have 3 levels, about 60,000 square feet of space. We expect to get about 420,000 visitors a year, a lot of high-tech interactive exhibitions. But most importantly, I think, for this discussion today, I think that museum will become the National Center for Law Enforcement History and Safety. That's where we'll have some very topical discussions about this important issue of officer safety and wellness. So if we could advance the next couple slides, the next one after that. And we're going to talk about the big picture when it comes to officer safety and wellness. I mentioned 20,789 names on the National Memorial. 55% of those officers were killed by gunfire. Traffic-related deaths account for about 30% of all officer fatalities. But interestingly, 15 of the last 20 years, we've actually had more officers killed in traffic-related incidents than any other cause. And then you see other causes. That includes heart attacks, stabbings, falls, you name it. Officers are always at risk, and we include all of those names on our memorial. The next slide, we talk about service and sacrifice. So what are the facts? Well, the facts are these, that somewhere in America, every 61 hours on average, an officer is killed in the line of duty. That's 144 officer fatalities each year on average over the last decade. We know that at least 57,000 officers are assaulted and attacked by criminals each and every year. That's an underreported figure kept by the FBI, but that's rather alarming to think that that many officers are under attack each year. And more than 100,000 officers are injured each year in the line of duty. And most amazingly of all of these statistics, perhaps, is the fact that 900,000 officers still go out every day, putting their life at risk for our safety and our protection. And clearly we owe all of these men and women a huge debt of gratitude. Total fatalities on the next graph, you see in 1930, that was the year we had more officer fatalities than any other year in history. 301 officers killed in 1930, right at the peak of Prohibition, the most deadly period of time in the history of our nation for law enforcement. You see in the 1970s, there was another major spike, officers being killed at a very alarming rate. 1974, those deaths peaked at 280. And then in 2001, we saw another peak, and of course that was the year 72 officers were killed during the terrorist attacks of 9/11. So that certainly added to the numbers that year. But thankfully, you notice in this graph that the numbers have gone down rather steadily over the last few years. And here you see an interesting chart. This shows you how many officers on average were killed each year during those particular decades. And you see again the 1920s, the deadliest period in law enforcement history, 244 officers killed each year on average, 231 in the 1970s. That was the annual death rate for officers. And then thankfully in the 2010s, the current decade, you see that we're only averaging 135, a very high figure, but certainly relatively speaking, that is a much more favorable number. Next slide, you see the states with the most officer fatalities. Texas leads the nation, a very dubious distinction, certainly, with almost 1,700 deaths throughout the history of Texas, followed by California, New York, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. And then on the next slide, we look at profile of officers killed in 2015. We like to emphasize that it's not the rookie right out of the academy that's being killed in the line of duty. It's the officer who served about 12 years on average, about 41 years of age, and most are males. Last year, 115 were male, only 9 were female killed in the line of duty. And I think this points to something that we talk about often, which is complacency sometimes can put officers at risk. If you've done the same traffic stop over and over again, sometimes you let your guard down, you serve warrants over and over again, nothing bad happens, you may let your guard down. So we've got to make sure that officers never take any assignment for granted, because every assignment, as you know better than I, is potentially life-threatening. The next slide, I always like to talk about the profile of cop killers. Who are these men and women who kill law enforcement officers? You see that most of them have had a prior criminal arrest. No surprise there, about 80% if you look at the last 5 years. And we notice that 31%, almost a third, had a prior criminal arrest for assaulting an officer or resisting arrest. So obviously these folks have self-identified themselves at an earlier period in time that they are the future cop killers that we need to be concerned about. You notice, too, that about 20% were under some form of judicial supervision for some other crime. They were out on parole or probation for another crime they had committed when they murdered that law enforcement professional. So again, we've got to get tougher with the worst of the worst criminals. We more or less know who are going to pose the greatest threat, not only to law enforcement, but to the innocent citizens of our nation. And also, there in the final 2 bullets, you notice that if you add those numbers together, about 37% of all the cop killers were under the influence of alcohol or narcotics at the time that they murdered that law enforcement officer. So certainly alcohol and drugs have played a major role in posing threats to officers. Next slide, we talk about just the fact we always emphasize that don't be distracted by all the noise you're hearing, a lot of negativity being directed toward law enforcement. a lot of high-profile incidents. We can't allow that to change. The fact that you need to be situationally aware all the time, that you are potentially under attack. You may be targeted at any given time simply because of the uniform that you wear. A lot of weak-minded individuals have been influenced by all this anti-cop rhetoric. The good news, though, is that the recent Gallup poll that came out just last week found that 76% of all citizens in this country either highly respect or respect the men and women serving them in law enforcement. And that's the highest figure we've seen since 1965 when they first started doing that survey, when 77% of the folks surveyed said they highly respect or respect officers. So clearly, despite a lot of negative noise, you are highly respected by the communities you serve, but still there are those weak-minded individuals you've got to be concerned about, and that's what we want you to think about as you look at this slide. Next one, we look at the comparison of officer fatalities 2015 versus 2014, and you see that the numbers remained, in terms of the total, pretty consistent. 123 officer fatalities last year, 122 the year before. Firearms-related deaths actually were down in 2015. Traffic-related deaths virtually unchanged. But then you look to the next slide, and you see 2016 versus 2015, and that's where things are truly alarming, and a couple of good examples here. Deaths overall up 10%. We hate to see that because we had been trending downward the last few years, but unfortunately this year the numbers are up pretty significantly. Firearms-related deaths are the #1 reason why. We've had 49 officers already shot and killed this year, 14 of them in ambush-style attacks, simply targeted because of the uniform that those officers wore and the jobs that they did. That's a 48% increase over the firearms-related deaths at the same time in 2015. That's our biggest red flag. Traffic-related deaths slightly higher this year, 2 more than the same time last year, but that number is holding pretty steady, and we've been pleased to see that traffic-related deaths have gone down in recent times. And then you see the other causes also down. A lot of those are heart attacks, so when we see a reduction in other causes, that probably means we've had fewer heart attack related deaths this year, and that's good news because a lot more emphasis is being placed on officer wellness, a lot more physical fitness activities at departments, and emphasis on officer wellness is paying off seemingly. Next slide, we look at some of the good news. One in particular, and we talk about officer safety when it comes to traffic, the number of officers struck and killed while outside of their vehicle has declined in each of the last 4 decades. You see back in 1976 to 85, we had 183 officers struck and killed during that 10-year period. That's over 18 per year. And during the most recent complete 10-year period, 128 officers struck and killed. That's down significantly, about a 30% decrease over what it was 40 years ago. Move over and slow down laws in every state now have made a difference. I see that a lot anecdotally when I'm driving on the interstate. It seems like whenever there's that police vehicle on the side of the roadway, people do slow down. They do move over a lane. More people are aware of those laws, and that's saving lives. High visibility apparel has also helped to make a difference. Officers wearing that high visibility apparel at nighttime in particular and in dangerous driving conditions, and that's helping them be seen by the driving public. Concerns moving forward, and we'll talk about several here. First of all, 15 of the last 20 years, as I mentioned, more officers killed in traffic-related incidents than firearms, and there you see the particular numbers. You see many more have died in those traffic-related incidents than killed by firearms during that 20-year period. Next slide, we look at the last 5 years, and we find that 53% of the officers killed in single vehicle crashes were on patrol or administrative assignment. They weren't chasing fleeing felons. They weren't responding to emergency calls at high rates of speed. But this is very troubling. It makes us concerned about distracted driving, drowsy driving, you know, our officers having fatigue and they fall asleep at the wheel. I mean, there's a number of reasons why this may be happening, but we need to dig deeper into those 53% of those traffic crashes, single car crashes, as to why those officers died during what seemingly were benign situations. And also a total of 27 officers since the first incident in 1996 have been killed while deploying spike sticks. So clearly we need to do more in terms of training our officers to deploy spike sticks in a safer manner, and also maybe the equipment itself needs to be modified and enhanced so that officers can deploy spike sticks while not putting themselves at such great risk. Some other troubling concerns on the next slide. We see that this is one of my pet peeves that we talk about all the time. Last year, 38% of the officers killed in auto crashes were not wearing seat belts. And the seat belts, we know, save lives. We preach it to the public every day. We give the public tickets when they're not buckled up, and yet too many officers are not putting on their seat belts. And as we've talked about here, traffic-related incidents pose the greatest threat to officers. So to argue that somehow the not wearing a seatbelt is going to make it safer for an officer, easier to get in and out of the vehicle, that's just not the case. We need to wear our seatbelts. Also, in 2015, 48% of those fatal auto crashes were single vehicle crashes. Again, perhaps the most preventable type of death to an officer. Officers driving sometimes too fast under the conditions to try to get to an emergency call as quickly as possible. We get it. That's why officers are out there, to save people in need. But unfortunately, too many officers are putting themselves at risk driving too fast for the conditions. Also, in 2015, we just emphasized 48 officers killed in traffic-related incidents. That's a very high number. Again, a very preventable type of death, seemingly. And there you see the breakdown in terms of automobile crashes, struck and killed, motorcycle, and then how many suspects had been charged. At least in 9 of those cases, 3 were impaired. Next slide, we look at how many officers have been killed in ambush-style attacks since 2014. This has really gotten alarming. 35 officers killed in ambush attacks since 2014. Officers that have been targeted by these criminals, Islamic terrorists, mentally deranged individuals, sovereign citizen types, you name it. And there's a lot of people out there that seem to have a hatred toward law enforcement, and unfortunately 35 officers have been killed since 2014 as a result. Also, and this is another pet peeve, something that could really make a difference if more officers just wore their body armor. We know that over the last 3 decades, roughly, there have been more than 3,100 law enforcement lives that have been saved by officers who were wearing body armor. And yet in 2015, 29% of the officers killed in the line of duty were not wearing body armor at the time of that fatal incident. And we know that, you know, there you see the number. It's estimated that the risk of dying from gunfire is 14 times higher for an officer not wearing body armor. But, you know, we've done some studies on this and found that really the majority of officers who've been saved by their body armor were in non-firearms related situations. A lot of times that body armor will save you when you have a car crash from the blunt force trauma that you might incur hitting the steering column, for example. Officers have been saved by their vests in strucken incidents, you know, outside of their vehicle, struck by another vehicle. That vest will help save your life. Stabbings, you name it. There's a lot of ways that vests help you when you're an officer, and we got to emphasize how important that is to wear your vest. So now we'll talk about the changing culture of law enforcement safety. And I always, before I turn it over to Nick, I always like to talk about what's happening with our neighbor to the north. I've had the privilege of attending several of their memorial services in Canada, up in Ottawa. It's the last Sunday every year in September. It's a very, very moving ceremony, beautifully displayed in terms of the pomp and circumstance, situated there at their nation's capital. But most importantly at those memorial services, so many fewer officers being honored having died in the line of duty. In fact, in 2015, just 3 officers in the entire nation of Canada died in the line of duty, and only 1 of those was the result of a traffic crash. Now, we know that Canada doesn't have the problem with guns that we have here in our nation in terms of too many criminals having access to firearms and committing crimes, but we know that Canada does have very difficult driving conditions due to their weather. And yet, for some reason, and largely you'll find that it's because they emphasize officer safety and wellness to a much greater extent than we've done here in the United States in recent decades, they have far fewer fatalities and injuries. So just some lessons to be learned from our neighbor to the north. Canada does a great job and has for many, many years before we started having mandatory vest wear policy, mandatory seatbelt wear policy, promoting aggressively the move over and slow down laws there in Canada. They have a program that stresses arrive alive. Basically, they call it guaranteed arrival. They stress from day 1 of the academy, get to that call safely before you have to render aid. You're not doing anybody any help if you crash your vehicle trying to respond to an emergency or chasing a fleeing felon. So these are just some examples that we like to cite. I'm going to turn things over now to Nick Breul, my colleague, who's going to talk a little more about some of the specific work we're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Craig, and I'll be picking up on a number of points. As you saw there, Craig pretty much set the table for what's happening, what it is that is causing law enforcement deaths, and mentioned a couple of things that we focus on specifically in traffic safety, where we think improvement can be made in saving lives. Craig has been the Memorial and the Memorial Fund for 32 years, so he has a great deal of experience with a lot of this. And he sets the table very well in putting everything into perspective so we can then talk about where we can improve. The first thing I want to talk about is Destination Zero. Now, this is one of the grant-funded programs we run. You can, if you look at the bottom there, it says www.destinationsero.org. This is a resource for you. This whole presentation is about helping law enforcement agencies find resources and find those answers on how to improve their officer safety and find out what it is that the data is showing. So I'll point up a couple of major items that we draw out of the winners for last year's Destination Zero Awards. Fairfax County, Virginia, which is a local suburb outside of Washington, D.C., they took the bold step and have done so for a couple of years of incorporating Incident Command Systems safety officer into any of their major incidents. One of the things that we talk about when we're talking about a culture of safety is really approaching things almost like the fire service does in how they handle their scenes, how they approach their scenes, the common language they use, as well as the hot washes that they may take themselves through following an incident. So Fairfax County has a full-time safety officer. It's an official, so it's a sergeant or above, who's designated as that individual. So if there is a barricade, a demonstration, a major crash, or any other incident which is large in scale, that individual's sole purpose is to make sure that the officers are safe, that there are no hazards that need to be mitigated, that they're doing everything appropriately and safely to ensure that they have no other problems. So it's not just officer safety, it's also risk management. And it extends all the way down to handling their needle sticks. There's an opioid problem in the United States. Not everybody's injecting drugs, but a number of people in Fairfax County are, and they have a problem with officers still having needle sticks, and that's part of the safety officers program, is to manage that, counsel the officer, and ensure they're getting the proper treatment and documentation. But it goes all the way down to ensuring that, say you send somebody to go pick up a trailer, and this is a story that actually came out of Fairfax County. They have a scuba team, and they sent somebody to go pick up the scuba trailer and put that trailer on the hitch on one of their pickups to bring it to a scene where they needed to effect a rescue and a search, or a search and recovery. That individual hadn't been trained, and if you know anything about towing vehicles, certain tow balls don't match with certain trailers, and you know, they had a problem when they were pulling that trailer. It almost came unhinged and ended up rolling next to that pickup instead of behind it. So it's a true culture of safety there. They're taking everything to an account as well as risk management. Hillsborough, North Carolina, they won for officer traffic safety. I like to talk about them because they're a small agency, and so many agencies across the United States are small agencies. They have fewer than 50 officers. Hillsborough, North Carolina, and I would encourage you to look up their program on the website. Of course, they're in North Carolina, so they get the advantage of NASCAR being down there, but they created their own traffic safety course that involved decision-making stations. It involved using go-kart tracks to train their officers, so officers are comfortable with how they drive their cars. It also encompassed a mandatory seatbelt policy. Some agencies have it, but a lot of them don't enforce it. Hillsborough, North Carolina took the steps to make sure that their officers are wearing their seatbelts. And then you have San Diego, which is a wellness program, and that's something we talk about in other portions of what we're doing. We're sort of focusing on traffic safety here today. NYPD also won for comprehensive safety, and one thing that I would point out from the programs and the shifts that they're making, again, towards a culture of safety, I'm not sure how everyone else's experience was on the police department, but I know mine was, I was in the academy for 6 months, didn't get my assignment until I walked off the stage. Well, NYPD took the step of assigning their recruits to districts or precincts or to whatever it may be. If you're out there and say you're at a community group, like in Salisbury, Maryland, where all the officers go to one academy but then get sent out to cities or towns, they gave them their assignment right in the academy, and those officers work part-time in their districts. And this avoids that whole problem that is a cultural problem in law enforcement of that first day when the rookie officer gets in the car with the training officer, and we all know what the training officer tells them, and I'll say it since we can't resonate here, but it says he'll tell the rookie officer, forget everything you learned in the academy. Well, that doesn't do anybody any good, particularly from safety, and you know, so I thought NYPD's step of assigning their officers and getting them to go to academies early on, getting them to go to their precincts early on helped get them into the service better with less of a difficult transition. So that's enough about Destination Zero. Destination Zero is a good resource for you. We also work with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Nitsa. Everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with Nitsa. You can go on our website, and we have downloadable posters, fact sheets, as well as a video we're going to show you later, and another video that we made, all to help you to get your folks' mind right about safety. Craig talked about move-over laws. But we really want law enforcement to look at what the data shows and to make changes. And you'll see with some of the data I'll present you in a little bit, some of these things are preventable, and we want to focus on that sort of low-hanging fruit, if you will, that can help us make a difference to save lives. Here is a photo. That's it's titled Administrator, Dr. Mark Rosekind. And the reason I have this photo up here is not because we gave him an award. We gave him an award because they worked so well with us, but because Dr. Rosekind is a survivor. His father was a San Francisco police motorman who was killed in the line of duty, and for all the time that he has been with Nitsa, he has been a true advocate for law enforcement safety. It's not just talk. He's backed it up, and the grants that we receive and the work that we're doing is evidence of that. But I think it's important for people to know out there that there are people who are in this job who really care and who, like Dr. Rosekind, get it. And we'll also talk about, a little bit later, I'll talk about what Dr. Rosekind did before he became the administrator of Nitsa, because it ties into some of the stuff we're looking at. So we do research for Nitsa, and depending upon where you're calling in from, you'll see how the Nitsa breaks down its regions. We have Region 6 circled. Craig had mentioned earlier that Texas has one of the highest numbers of law enforcement deaths. Of course, it's the biggest state, so that goes without saying, but there is an extraordinary number in there, Region 6, that are involved in crashes. You see 65, and the number that I don't have up there, but it's between the dates of 2011 through 2015 that we gathered that data. And within that 5-year period, 65 of those fatal crashes and or fatal traffic-related deaths came from Region 6. So we're now focusing on Region 6, and we're going out to Region 6 to help get the word out about seatbelts, body armor, reducing speed. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, as well as traffic stops and other safety measures that can be employed to help reduce these line-of-duty deaths. And that's not to say we ignore other regions at all. We don't. We go to other regions, but we definitely want to focus where the problem is. So here's a slide that breaks down the number of crashes between 2011 and 2015. And for us here at the Memorial Fund, what we call a traffic-related death involves those 3 categories: a struck by, where an officer is outside of their vehicle, a motorcycle crash, or an automobile crash. And then we'll break auto crashes out even further into actual collisions with other motor vehicles or single vehicle crashes where the patrol car has left the roadway and struck a fixed object or rolled over. And you see how the crash numbers, from 2011 they go down a little bit, and then they sort of remain steady in the 40s. You see 49 and 48 there for 2014 and 2015. We have, I think, 44 already this year, so I mean, it kind of looks like we're going to be sort of in that same area. One of the startling statistics that we're seeing right now that, as Craig touched on the comparison slide between 2016 and 2015, I think we've had 11 struck bys already this year. That's very high. And we've also had 8 moto crashes this year, which is higher than last year. We were very encouraged early on this year when our single vehicle crashes were very low. At one point we had only 3 single vehicle crashes compared to 9 at that point last year, and that was through July and August of this year. But now, unfortunately, we've had a number of single vehicle crashes, so that number has gone up a little bit. So here's what we've talked about, and we're going to show a video in a minute that I think you can use to show your organizations and, as I like to say, get people's mind right. But you see, we've improved on seatbelts. These are officers not wearing their seatbelts, and you see the numbers have gone down, but 38% is still high. And I want to show you this video now that was made by the Orange County Sheriff's Department in California, and they distributed it to their officers to try and encourage them to wear their seatbelts.
Priority 1, 12 Sam 1, copy for info.
18-12-26.
AOA Station 32. Officer needs assistance. Shots fired in the area. 913 for code 3 response.
1226, 10-4, code 3.
Daddy, aren't you going to wear your seatbelt?
So that's part of a video that was put together, as you saw there, by the Orange County Sheriff's Office that was part of Destination Zero. They made that part of a program called For Your Partners and For Your Family. And they placed a strong emphasis on wearing your seatbelt. I like that video. It was a little jumpy, and I apologize for that. I think that's the nature of the internet, but I like that video because there's so many safety messages actually couched within it that we're talking about in law enforcement today. If you saw the equipment that he put in the back of his cruiser, there was tactical equipment with heavy armor as well as a Kevlar helmet to protect him from rifle fire and that give him that additional protection. The call he got that he was being dispatched to was an officer needs assistance, shots fired call. And that plays right into one of our other statistics that I'll mention more than once. And in another study we did from 2010 to 2014, we looked at what runs officers were crashing en route to the most. And this is part of a larger study for calls for service, which I'll reference. But the number of, the highest number of crashes involved officers responding to officer needs assistance calls. So, you know, you can't assist if you can't arrive. We all know that officers want to get to that call. I understand that urgency, but I think in our statistics, 78% of the calls for service, the 78% of those crashes were officers responding to officer needs assistance calls, and of course the help never arrived. This slide that's up now, one of the things that we do is we also break the crashes out by department type, and this helps when we go and speak to sheriffs, or if we go speak to the troopers, or if we're even speaking to our federal partners. Of course, you see municipal agencies represent the highest, 47% of the fatal crashes involve municipal agencies. So here's the big statistic that I've talked about already, and we want everybody to sort of focus on. Of 166 fatal automobile crashes between 2011 and 2015, 49% were single vehicle crashes. So that's roughly half of the auto crashes were single vehicle crashes. Average age of the operator in those single vehicle crashes was 38 years old. Again, not necessarily a rookie, and that's, I always thought it would be the rookies driving too fast and you know, over driving themselves in the car, but that does not appear to be the case here. And on the next slide, you'll see how we broke out those single vehicle crashes since as they've increased since 2012. And over that 5-year period, we did have a reduction in 2012 that went down to 26, but you see we went up to 34 last year. And again, you see they're roughly half of all the crashes are single vehicle crashes. So here's the sort of, to me, startling statistic that we pulled out of the data that we did when we were looking at responses to runs or what officers were doing, and really asked us to ask the question, what's going on in the car? What's going on behind the wheel of that car when these officers are involved in single vehicle crashes? Overwhelmingly, speed is a factor, but there could be something else. We all know that these patrol cars have a lot of distractions. They've got the MDC with messages constantly coming in. There are officers with cell phones. There is a lot of equipment in that car that could be distracting these officers. And as you see, 53% of those single vehicle crashes they were not on an assigned run. They were either on a patrol or admin assignment. Some of the areas where these crashes have occurred are huge areas. So you have deputies or agencies that have large areas, swaths to patrol, and but it begs the question, what is going on behind that wheel? And one of the things that ties us back to Dr. Rosekind is he had actually done sleep studies before he was the administrator of Nitsa, and he had talked about the fact that, you know, drowsy driving is a real problem, and there's no doubt it's a problem within law enforcement agencies, especially with guys who are doing shift work. I mean, what if you have an officer who is in court all day and he's a midnight officer, or he or she's a midnight officer, now they're getting back into their car. I know I went through that. I know that there are many times when we work extended shifts, and I knew of other officers who actually were working part-time jobs. So we have a lot of fatigued police officers out there, and that's something that needs to be looked at. How we're going to gather that data I'm not sure how we're going to get the stats as to whether they were drowsy or not, but it's certainly something that we need to look at in trying to answer the question about some of these single vehicle crashes, particularly when they're not on a run. Preventable as we train our officers. And as we talk about improving safety, we talk about wellness, and we talk about not only drowsy driving, but we talk about what officers are doing. A lot of officers are drinking a lot of these energy drinks. You have officers who are taking supplements. You know, when we do fatal crash investigations here, when we get all the information, we generally request toxicology as well. And you'd be surprised, unfortunately, in some circumstances, we receive information that shows the officer was impaired. So that's something that we have to look at, and agencies have to look at. If we can go to the next slide. So how did an agency successfully reduce its crashes, reduce subsequently its liability, and improve its officer safety? Here's another Destination Zero winner that was a 2015 winner from Yolo County, California. I don't want everybody to get the idea that California is the only state that has good ideas. There are lots of states that have great ideas. The last two examples just happen to come from California. But what Captain Larry Ceccattini of the Yolo County Sheriff's Office did was, in conjunction with below 100 training and a mandatory seatbelt policy, they decided to monitor their deputies' speeds, and they set an arbitrary speed activation at 90 miles an hour. And basically what they were doing is using the inboard camera to send a notification, an activation, if you will, to let supervisors know if a deputy has gone 90 miles an hour and above. And they then enacted a policy that if you were to go 90 miles an hour or above, you had to notify an official, and the official might challenge you as to why you're doing that. And it was simply a safety policy, seeing if they could reduce crashes. And again, to some, 90 miles an hour might sound really high. Why didn't they set it lower? That was the miles per hour they decided to start with. So if you're looking at this chart on the left from January, February, March, April, May, all the way through to October, you see the number of activations they had in those months with their deputies driving 90 miles an hour and over. Doesn't mean they can't do it. It just means that now, starting in November, they wanted the deputies to explain or voice over the radio that they were traveling at a speed at 90 or greater. Once you see that for November, that's a pretty dramatic drop back down to 22, and then the subsequent drop all the way down. And the big takeaway from this graph is that over that next 2-year period, they did not have an at-fault crash. Meanwhile, prior to that, they had a deputy, and when Captain Ceccattini does the training, he shows an inboard video, dash cam video of one of his deputies who is responding to a traffic crash. It's 27 miles away, it's a priority run, and the deputy, unfortunately, is on his cell phone telling his girlfriend that he's going to be late, or speaking to someone telling him that he's just gotten a late run, he's going to be late, and then, of course, he's on his cell phone, he's distracted, and he has a crash. So that, coupled with the speed reductions, the mandatory seatbelt policy, and a greater awareness about safety, has reduced their crashes. Some people might say it's Big Brother. There are agencies and vehicle manufacturers now that are making programs that can allow you to monitor whether the seatbelt's plugged in, what route your officers are taking, and things like that. I know that there are a lot of issues with all that, but this was a simple way for them to monitor speed, just speed, and reduce high speeds, and thereby reducing a lot of their crashes that they were suffering. So some other steps to take as you look at the data we're giving you. Of course, I've mentioned speed, seatbelt and vest policy, which Craig spoke to. Again, ballistic vests are important in almost every phase of law enforcement and can protect you in a number of things, as Craig said, in a struck-by crash or in a collision or from an assault. Consider a right-side approach. As we see officers being struck and killed, a number of times we see that it's a left-side approach. And of course, we encourage officers, if you're working in the roadway, to wear retroreflective, high-visibility vests. Some departments have policies, others don't, but if you know about ANSI and you know about fire service and EMS, you know that there are requirements about what it is they have to wear and what the requirements of that retroreflectivity is. Also, enhancing your vehicle conspicuity, you see, again, getting to that culture of safety. The fire service has those chevrons that are red and yellow on the back of every single one of their trucks. It's hard to miss. Law enforcement needs to consider enhancing their vehicle's visibility. One of the other things that they did at YOLO was an incentive. You know, it wasn't all just the stick. There was a little bit of the carrot as well. So there were safe driving awards. There were challenge coins given out to officers for safe driving records, getting back to that whole idea that you can reward officers for doing the right thing. Some agencies also, this is particularly true with wellness strategies, were able to negotiate with insurance companies and providers with regard to premiums if officers were taking certain classes or getting certain tests. Again, that insurance bullet there applies largely to wellness, where you're able to reduce some premiums if you have people that are participating in fitness programs, getting their PSA test, or going for breast cancer screening, or cessation of smoking programs, things like that. Back on the traffic side for training, below 100, hopefully most of you have heard about below 100 and its 5 tenets. Hopefully everybody knows what TIMS, Traffic Incident Management, stands for, and we're a big proponent of TIMS because that takes us to that culture of safety and gets us all on those major crash scenes working together and working the same way to the same standard. I'll mention in a minute respondersafety.com, but that's a place where you can get a TIMS certificate online. Also, driving skills. I talked about Hillsborough County, the decision-making stations, getting the officers to focus down the road for hazards, not getting tunnel vision, and training them through the training program how to recognize hazards before they appear. And then also sharing resources. One great example is Ohio State. Nationwide Insurance helped sponsor training for them to give below 100 to every agency within the state of Ohio. But one of the great things that came out of there was resource sharing, where if there was a sheriff's agency that wanted to take the training, the state police would come in and handle their calls for that day that they were at the training, and then there would be a similar response for other agencies where perhaps a municipal agency would come in and cover a township's calls for service and vice versa, and that really got agencies to talk to each other, but not only that, they got to know each other's territory and possibly began to break down some of those barriers we all know exist between not competing agencies, but various agencies in law enforcement. So one other thing that is out there to help us make things safer is the Leo Near Miss program. This is being run through the Police Foundation, a friend and partner of ours. And if you go to leonearmiss.org, you'll see there is a form that you can fill out. It's a non-punitive reporting form where all they want is the data. And this isn't just crashes. This is everything from crossfire situations, equipment failure situations, or near struck-by situations, anything within the station house, out on the scene of an incident, handling a call for service, or out on the roadway where something happened that everybody looked at each other and kind of wiped their brow and went, whoo, that was close. That needs to be documented, because if it was close this time, it may not be close next time. So you can go on to leonearmiss.org, and if you have those, and we asked this question in the session we were in last week with an officer safety wellness working group. And the question was, well, how far back do they want to go? In other words, you know, if I got a story from 2 years ago, do they want to hear about it? The answer is yes. So don't think that it's something that has to come up that you then have to put in their system this year. They're looking for any and all data to try and put together where we're having the near misses and help prevent future accidents. And here are some additional resources. I know we've been kind of firing a lot of stuff at you. Again, I mentioned TIMS and the Federal Highway Administration, and then there's respondersafety.com. You can get your traffic incident management certificate online. I'm doing that, as well as Desiree Luongo, who works with me on our grants program. I was a traffic safety lieutenant here in MPD, and I wish I had had this certificate program available to me and my people for learning quick clearance, but also basic closure procedures, as well as, you know, common language and common approaches to how you're going to handle a crash scene. NIOSH is up there, and NIOSH is up there because as we talk about really imbuing that culture of safety in law enforcement, NIOSH is doing what they've done with the fire service for years. They are doing studies of fatal crashes. They've done a study of seatbelt usage in Indiana, which is available on their website, and they've done a study of a crash in New Mexico. And again, that crash pointed up a couple of things where you had multiple agencies working multiple crashes, but in the same area of a two-lane highway under bad weather conditions. And the report sort of points up the fact that ICS, the Incident Command System, probably should have been initiated. It was difficult to get decision makers on who can close the roadway and how they were going to mitigate that, as you had so many different jurisdictions coming and simply responding to the crashes as they occurred, but not necessarily mitigating the hazard, as well as working together the way a perhaps traffic incident management system would have had them work. So it's a very good, it's not, no one's blaming anybody or anything like that. It's just simply NIOSH coming in and looking what happened and coming up with recommendations. So it's not trying to make anybody look bad or feel bad. I mentioned below 100. Hopefully you've heard of that. And then, of course, there's also the IACP. They have their own Center for Officer Safety and Wellness, which you can find on their website. We were just at IACP and did this presentation in San Diego, and we got a lot of interest in it. And before I forget, you can go to our website, the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial website at memorial.org, or sorry, lawmemorial.org. And you can, under Programs and Events, find our Nitsa tab. And under our Nitsa tab, those videos are there, as well as additional safety information and resources for you. So one of the other things we want to look at is new technologies. I don't know if anyone's seen the portable speed hump or speed bump before. That was something we discovered a couple of years ago. I haven't seen a lot of talk about it, and you know, we don't want to do product placement here, but I thought it was a pretty good idea. There was a crash last year where a trooper was killed on the scene of another crash, and you know that's quite common where you have secondary crashes, but here a semi-tractor trailer was turned over. And there are flares in the roadway, and all the visual signals that you'd think would be appropriate to keep someone from coming into that scene. And sure enough, a guy texting on his phone came flying into that scene and killed a trooper. Perhaps if there was a device that was upstream that would have gotten that driver's attention, such as a speed hump like that, maybe he would have looked up and seen the impending hazard. The other thing you see there is a portable stop stick device or spike stick device that can be remotely set out in the roadway, so you don't have officers trying to pull those things out of in front of the suspect vehicle and then trying to have to run and pull it out of the way before the pursuing vehicles get their tires flattened. So certainly there are more safety resources out there, so officers are not putting themselves in harm's way. And I mentioned this in the report, and this is where we looked at types of calls for service. We also then looked at self-initiated activity and what were some of the common themes that came out of looking at those calls for service. One of the things was officers not waiting for their backup. We had situations where officers were handling domestic violence calls by themselves or requesting backup, but then going into the location by themselves, not waiting for the backup, and those were not under exigent circumstances, but of course they became exigent once the officer was in there by themselves. And then also some other details about officers needing to do a better job about communicating with each other before they handle some of these calls for service. We also looked at self-initiated activity, what was happening when officers were stopping suspicious cars and suspicious persons or taking that self-initiated activity and making a traffic stop. I mentioned already the trends in crashes involving responses to calls for service, and that was the larger number. Officers were crashing en route to officer needs assistance calls. Again, that's a training point. We can train our guys to slow down and make sure they arrive to render that aid that our officers need. And again, you can see, I think this is going to be also available. I think Paul said that this is being recorded, so you can probably get the recorded version from our folks at LaserTech, but you'll also be able to find this presentation here at that site. And I think that's it. I think that's it.
I do have some questions here that have come in. So I'd like to some are comments, but some are questions here. So I got a question saying, I've seen the long-term average annual numbers before, but no one seems to correlate the numbers with population increase and police position increase. More of a comment.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we talk about related to that is that the number of officer fatalities has dropped dramatically since the 1970s. I think the slide earlier showed 231 officer fatalities each year during the 1970s versus 135 during the current decade. That's a very significant drop, but it makes it even more significant when you realize that the number of officers serving in this country have more than doubled during that period of time. So I think that the safety numbers are even more impressive than you might think otherwise. If you're going to increase the number of officers by more than double over a period of time, you would expect the officer fatality numbers to also go up as a result of more officers being at risk. But just the opposite has happened, and that's largely due to a lot of the things we talked about, but just generally better training, better equipment, more or less lethal weaponry available so officers don't have to deal with hand-to-hand combat, better emergency medical care, and to some extent tougher criminal justice for the worst of the worst offenders. So all of that has helped to drive these numbers down. Certainly bullet-resistant vests have probably been the #1 reason of all. If you look at more than 3,100 documented saves by vests for officers. And now we have more officers. It's mandatory that you wear your vest. It's mandatory that you wear your seat belts. I think more and more officers, the numbers show it, are doing just that. So all of that has made a difference at a time when the number of officers serving has gone up, as well as the number of people living in those jurisdictions.
Great, thanks. I have another comment just regarding that. It was saying, hey, regarding the video, wear a seatbelt and a vest. Vest can assist in vehicle accidents as well, deflecting or absorbing impacts. Have seen it. So that's just reinforcing what
absolutely.
are saying.
Yeah, that's a great point, and you heard us both say it, and I think a lot of people, even for the data that we grab when we're looking at struck bys, when we're looking at crashes, and we're looking at course of shootings, we're asking the question, do they have their vest on? And it's very important. It can protect you in a lot of ways.
And then I do have a question that's regarding, you may address this later on. This was actually a little bit earlier. I apologize for not addressing it sooner. It says, you may address this later on, but can I reference, it looks like your slides and materials in my below 100 classes?
Absolutely. We work with Dale Stockton from Below 100. We had a meeting with him when we were at IACP. We're all on the same page. This is all about saving lives, you guys, if anybody needs to, they can email me and I can share with them whatever they need. This is all about improving officer safety and wellness and saving lives.
That's great. I do wanted to just address everyone that did attend live to today's webinar. You will be entered to win a reflective jacket here. So we'll be doing that drawing later today, and we'll notify that winner via email from your registration page. So we really do appreciate everyone joining us today, and certainly want to leave it open. We do have some time, a minute or two here for more questions. So if anybody likes to have share any questions or thoughts, please do that now. We do have a comment here saying excellent presentation, well done, and I strongly agree. I really appreciate Craig and Nick, your time and your knowledge of sharing what you did today. So thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity. That's why we're here, and encourage everyone to contact our office whenever you need any information, maybe some data that you could present to your local elected officials, county council, city council. Because we believe that you can implement good policy, you can implement more resources for officers if you have data to support the need for that training, for that equipment, for those new policy changes. So come to us, we can help you develop that data. We probably have it and can easily provide it.
This is Nick. The other thing I'd mention is our COPS report is also on our website as well. The one that's deadly calls and fatal encounters, which is it should be an easy read. It's not a highfalutin academic report. It's us breaking down the data and telling you what we found, and hopefully it's useful to law enforcement and law enforcement executives, but not just executives, officers as well. And when we were at IACP, I got a couple of folks who were in some of the presentations we were doing stand up and thank me for the report because they were using portions of it to highlight their concerns with behaviors they were seeing in their officers. And that's what it's all about. And, I don't think we should ever be afraid of putting things through a hot wash, turning a critical eye to what it is we do, and improving our safety.
That's great. I have another question here is asking about, will Nitsa be working more with the Federal Highway Administration from what you guys know?
That's a good question, and the answer is yes, because, and again, I hate to keep harping back on the IACP, but I was we presented to the IADLEST group, which I think stands for International Association of Directors and Executive for Standards and Trainings. Now, I probably have that wrong, but IADLEST is a group of academy trainers and executives. We had Nitsa as well as BJA, Bureau of Justice Assistance, and Federal Highways all in the room addressing that group. And the Nitsa and the Federal Highway guys were all talking about some of the same programs. And they actually explained to me the difference between what it is they do, what the differences are, and I can't quite come up with that. But I think the answer is yes. And, of course, we work with both. Jim Ostrich is the guy from Federal Highways that I used to work with on MPD, who's now there, and is a tremendous resource. And again, I've already told you the tremendous support we get from Nitsa.
That's great. Just a couple more comments I'd like to share. It says, great presentation with valuable information to share with my agency. Thank you for your hard work in putting this together and distributing. And I have another comment here. Great presentation. Looking forward to more in the future. So, again, it's, obviously it's resonating with our attendance here, and looks like everyone really does appreciate this content.
Well, so what everyone should know is, so we go from 2011 to 2015. We take a 5-year window, and we'll be, of course, next year pulling in the 2016 year data as we go over and comb through all of the information we're getting this year. And I didn't mention our numbers. We just had, I think, Desiree, we had another fatal crash, as well as, and then we're looking at another shooting today in Fresno. So unfortunately, the numbers keep trending upward this year. But we're doing the best we can by using that information to make it safer.
And we'll be coming out with our end-of-the-year fatality report, which is based on the preliminary information we get up to that point of the year. and that'll come out on December 29th. So keep a lookout for that. We get a lot of media attention, and usually you can find that in your local papers, but we'll also be posting it on our website, lawmemorial.org, and you can get that full report as well as the press release that will be going out on December 29th.
Great. Looks like that's all the questions and comments I'm seeing at this point in time. And again, I would like to thank both of our panelists today and for your valuable information. So thanks again.
All right, our pleasure. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, guys, we'll end now. Thank you so much.